Finding Laura Bugs by Stanley Gordon West, Chapter 13, page 87. On the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, while I was getting ready to go to the turkey trot with Scott, I started brushing my teeth with Ben Gay. Gosh, I was flat out giddy because I could tell he really liked me. We bumped and bounced to the dance on the panel truck from Finley's Market where Cal worked on Saturdays. Cal's father didn't own a car, and Mr. Finley let Cal use the truck. It was nifty because there were no seats in the back, and Jerry and Sally and Steve and Jean slid around on the back deck with blankets for a little cushioning. I perched on Steve's lap in the front seat with Cal and Lola, and we were so crammed together that Lola had to move the stick shift when Cal used the clutch. We laughed and hooted, and I was in heaven, sitting there in Scott's lap with his arm around my waist, and I didn't care that the inside of the truck smelled like onions and ripe bananas, and that we probably would too. We finally got to the dance at the Columbia Chalet after Cal had zoomed around town for a while. The Associates and Sphinx were putting on the dance, and Gary Berg's band was playing, and I finally figured out how to get Scott out on the floor. I asked him if he wanted to dance, and he was too polite to turn me down. The basketball team had scrimmage Washburn that afternoon, and Scott said he shouldn't get too close to me because he was coming down with a cold. I told him I didn't care, and I made the poor boy dance most of the night. Scott had called me Sunday evening to ask me to the dance, and I was so excited I almost forgot to ask him if he'd talked to his father about Mr. Shapiro's checking account. Scott said he was waiting to catch his dad in the right mood, and I knew what he meant. Page 88. I got to see Mr. Shapiro on Tuesday after passing Betty Bain's usual inspection, but he'd slipped back into his old rut, talking about his son coming to get him and how he was going to live in Milwaukee. He did remember to ask if I brought any of my mother's sleeping pills, and I didn't understand how he could remember some things and totally forget others. I took a peek at his checks in the top drawer, and they appeared to be exactly the way I left them. When we'd finished a game of Chinese checkers and I knew it was time to go, I knelt in front of his wheelchair. "I'm going to adopt you," I shouted. "What are you talking about?" he grouched. "I don't have a grandpa, and I'm adopting you." I smiled and laughed, but he didn't change his hollow-cheeked grump. "That's poppycock. You can't adopt a grandpa." "Well, I just did, and you're my grandpa," I shouted, and I gave him a hug. I noticed he wasn't such a cold fish and how he leaned into the hug a little. "Goodbye, Grandpa Shapiro. I'll see you soon." "I'm not your dad-blame grandpa." I felt hopeless when I left, and I started to believe Betty Bain that he'd never remember my adoption. But I was mad, too, at the way they treated him, and I decided he was my Grandpa Shapiro, and I'd keep visiting him no matter what he remembered, and maybe they'd treat him better, knowing I was coming around. And maybe with Scott's father's help, we'd put one of them behind bars. After the dance, we ate at the drive-in over at Minnehaha Falls, and Scott and I were squished together. We had to feed each other. I'd dip a French fry in ketchup and stick it in his mouth, and then he'd feed me one. We shared a chocolate malt, and it seemed I could feel my breath growing right there in the grocery truck. Scott surprised me when he told me I had some malt on my lip and kissed me, the way it happens in the movies. It was heavenly, and he tasted like chocolate. Then he quickly turned his head and sneezed and just about blew me off his lap, except we were wedged into the truck so tightly there was nowhere to be blown. On the way home, I was praying that Cal would get up the nerve to park. I figured he wouldn't, being so new with Lola, but at least he drove around for another half hour before dropping us off. I kept wishing Scott would find more malt on my lips. When Cal walked Lola to the door at Highland Village Apartments, I stayed on Scott's lap, though there was room on the truck seat, and he held on to me as if he didn't want me to move. He kept blowing his nose and sneezing, but I wasn't about to keep me from such bliss. At the door, I reminded him about talking to his father, and he said he would for sure over the 4-day holiday. Then he blew his nose and said good night and quickly retreated to the truck. Thanksgiving Day, we went to the worship service at House of Hope, and I was giving thanks like crazy, and I came home stuffed like turkey with hope. When we sat down at our Thanksgiving dinner, my mom said a special prayer for Amelia Earhart and all the people who were being held captive in dungeons that day. My mom talked about her so often, I started believing Amelia was still alive. Friday was starting. I started feeling lousy and my head felt fuzzy, and I told Jean I couldn't go to the movies with her, and I went to bed early. By Saturday, I had a full-blown head cold, and I laid around all weekend terribly disappointed that I couldn't see Scott. He was laying low also, and he apologized for giving me his cold when we talked on the phone. I told him it was worth it, and then blushed at what I'd said, and was glad he couldn't see my face. I was worried about Mr. Shapiro, and I did everything I could to get rid of my cold. I slept a lot, drank lots of tea, ate buckets of chicken soup, took aspirin, and stuck Vicks Vapor Rub up my nose and on my chest. I did homework and felt lousy and couldn't wait for life to begin again. On Monday, I told my mother I felt fine and forced myself to go to school because I figured my cold was about over and knew if I stayed home, I wouldn't be able to see Mr. Shapiro. I hadn't seen him for almost a week, and I dreaded thinking about what might have happened. By afternoon, I was really bushed, but somehow I sensed my only chance at finding out who I was could be slipping through my fingers, and I was getting close enough to taste it. I called the home, and Betty Bain said I could see him, probably relieved that I hadn't been around for so long. The streetcar trip took longer than usual, and I caught myself biting my fingernails twice, and it always made me so mad, and my fingers looked terrible. All of a sudden, I got the chills, and I started coughing, and I could tell the cold had settled in my chest. When I transferred at Hennepin, I dashed in the drugstore. I got a box of Smith Brothers cough drops. When I walked the floor 4 blocks to the home, I sucked 2 cough drops as fast as I could. I was afraid Betty Bain would send me home without seeing Mr. Shapiro. I rounded the corner and saw a long black car parked in front of the home, a hearse. The fear I slept with every night had followed me into the daylight. Mr. Shapiro had died. I started to cry, and when I reached the home, a bored-looking man in a long black top coat leaning against the hearse. "Who died?" I said, wiping away my tears with my soaked hanky. "You got someone in there?" He nodded at the home. "Yes, my grandpa." It was a guy named Woodrow Gamble. "Oh, thank you, that's not him." Inside, another man in black was going over some papers with Betty at her desk. She paused and looked up at me. "I thought it was Mr. Shapiro," I said and blew my nose. It was a perfect cover. "No, you can save your tears." She moved her head like a cooing pigeon. "Mr. Shapiro is still with us." "Who did die?" I said, on the edge of the hall. "Woody," she said, and she turned her back to the undertaker. Woody had gotten me by her, and I hoped he was already happy in heaven making music for his long-lost love. I felt a sneeze coming on halfway to Mr. Shapiro's room, and I sneezed into my scarf, almost gagging myself in it in an effort to stifle it. Mr. Shapiro was sitting hunched over in his wheelchair, and when he turned his large magnified eyes on me, it was like a big owl perched in the tree, a mad owl. "Didn't think you'd be back." He was hurt, and I could imagine him sitting there all those days watching for me, and I didn't show. "Oh, I'm sorry, Grandpa. The days just got away from me. Don't you know I'll always be back?" "No skin off my hide if you come or not," he said, with his gravelly voice. "And I'm not your grandpa." I knelt beside his wheelchair and hugged him, and his stomach sounded like flushing toilet, and I thought I felt a sob shudder through the scrawny body. In his trembling hands he held an old photo of his 3 children, and with his large watery eyes, I couldn't tell if he'd been crying, but in front of his shirt were several damp spots. "You bring the pills?" he said quietly. I shook my head and wheeled the bed table between us. "Have you been having bad dreams again?" I shouted. He didn't understand as he set the photo on the dresser with a trembling hand. We played Chinese checkers, and I told him I had a very important man at First National Bank looking into his missing checks. Page 92. "Don't care about the money," he said. He broke wind, and I realized I didn't much notice anymore, and his gas and his rotten breath and his ornery disposition didn't matter. I caught a glimpse of the man hiding behind those thick lenses, and I knew he was terribly lonely and scared, and I knew he'd never admit it. He hated himself for being a coward, refused to forgive himself, and I knew how brave he was to carry on when he was so unloved, and his life had turned out so badly, and I realized I liked him. "You don't care that they're robbing you?" I kept my scarf around my neck, and I coughed into it as quietly as I could. "No, I don't care about the money. Everything I did was for money. My whole life was a mistake." I could feel him giving up, like he didn't care about anything anymore. He moved a marble several spaces and then turned those large red-rimmed eyes on me. I think I remembered the spring of 1933 last night. My heart just about popped out of my chest. Oh, Mr. Shapiro, try to remember. Had my first grandchild in May of 33, a little girl. Or was it 34? What else do you remember? I shouted, and I sneezed into my scarf and hoped Betty Bain was still busy with the undertakers. Or was I dreaming? He said, and his head bobbled gently. Can't tell the difference anymore. Try, Mr. Shapiro, try to remember. I remember it was a rainy spring, and I think I did the legal work on an adoption. It was a girl, but she was almost a year old, and I remember thinking my little granddaughter would be that big someday. Oh, Mr. Shapiro, that was me. Do you remember the name of the man who brought me to you? No, no, but it's funny. I don't think I like the man. Try to remember, please. What was his name? I was breathing hard and I started to cough and I couldn't stop. I sprang out of the chair and gulped a big drink of water from the glass on Mr. Shapiro's night table and the coughing stopped. I popped in another Smith Brothers and sat back at the checkerboard. Can you remember his name? He wanted $970, I said. It'll come to me. It'll come to me. Betty Bain slipped into the room like a bad mood. Well, who's winning today as if I didn't know? He remembered 1933. Please, can I stay a little longer? I didn't dare look at her. My chest ached and my head was plugged and I thought I was going to explode, but I was so close Mr. Shapiro broke wind, a cannon shot, and that distracted her. Still tooting along, aren't we, Arnie? She looked at me. I'm sorry, but you'll have to go now. Please, just this once. I'm sorry, but our patient's welfare must take precedence over all other matters. She rolled the bed table away, and I crouched in front of Mr. Shapiro. Try to remember the man's name, and if you remember, please write it down, please. Come now, let's let Arnie rest, she said, and she stood there like a jailer. I looked at Betty Bain. He looked at Betty Bain. Haul your ass out of here. I hugged him and picked up my coat and went into the hall with her. Will you please write down the name if he remembers, I said. Certainly, I'd be glad to help, she said, and I didn't believe a word of it. You sound like you have a cold, she said as we walked toward the front door. I was crying, I said, and then I used the family ploy. Did Woody die while he was playing? We don't know. When we found him, he was deader than a doornail. His saxophone was on the floor in front of him. I hope he was, I said. I buttoned my coat and wrapped my scarf around my head and tried not to cough until I escaped into the fresh air. Along Sheridan, I caught a glimpse of a crow in the coming darkness, gliding steadily in the huge spruce, roosting for the night. I hadn't been to the cave in a long time, and I longed to curl up in the arms of St. Peter Sandstone. All the way to the streetcar, I prayed that Mr. Shapiro would remember, prayed that I could get back before he lost the name again in the cluttered attic of his memory. The ride back to St. Paul took forever, and by the time I got home, I was chilled to the bone. I went straight to bed. My mother brought me chicken soup, and though I felt terrible and I was sad about Woody, I was dizzy with joy. I wanted to tell my mother that Mr. Shapiro remembered a little 1-year-old girl, and that little girl was me.